Gothic 4 Arcania has a reputation. One of the worst rated RPGs on Steam.
It's raw. That's raw. And the big surprise is the fucking
game, Gothic 4.
is fucking raw!
It was supposed to bring a cult classic into the modern era, but instead it became a punchline. Fans called it a betrayal, critics called it boring, and within a year the studio and publisher behind it were both dead. So, how did it all go so wrong? And was the game really as bad as everyone says? I played through Arcania from start to finish, and here's what happened. When Gothic 3 launched in 2006, it was supposed to be the RPG that would finally catapult the series into international spotlight. For European players, especially in Germany and Eastern Europe, Gothic had been a long cult favorite. Scrappy, hardcore, unforgiving, and wildly atmospheric. But outside of those regions, it was a well-kept secret. That was about to change, or so everyone thought. Instead, Gothic 3 arrived in a broken, chaotic state. Dozens of game-breaking bugs, combat that felt floaty and unsatisfying, quests that couldn't be completed. The game was huge and ambitious, sure, but it was also kind of a mess. Piranha Bytes, the small but fiercely passionate German studio behind the series, had clearly bitten off more than they could chew. And their publisher, JoWooD Entertainment, was losing patience. The fans tried to keep the flame alive. The community patch team spent years salvaging code, fixing hundreds of bugs that JoWooD never got around to. But the relationship between the developer and publisher had already fractured beyond repair. And by early 2007, it became official. JoWooD was pulling the Gothic license from Piranha Bytes. And just like that, the soul of the Gothic series was removed from the equation.
I'm gonna go fucking ballistic. Get a grip!
Enter Spellbound. A New Hope or a red flag. JoWooD still had the Gothic IP, and more importantly, they still had plans. Gothic was one of their biggest assets, and they weren't going to let it sit dormant just because the original developers had been cut loose. So they went hunting for a new studio to pick up the reins. They landed on Spellbound Entertainment, a mid-sized German developer best known at the time for Desperados, a solid isometric cowboy tactics game. Not exactly what you would call a natural fit for a dark fantasy RPG, but hey, JoWooD didn't need a replacement Piranha Bytes. They needed a studio that would deliver something more mainstream, more polished, less German RPG, and more Xbox 360 launch title. And so sometime around 2007, work began on Gothic 4. At least, sort of. Originally dubbed Gothic 4 Genesis, the game was supposed to continue the story from Gothic 3, but as development ramped up, JoWooD started making changes. Big ones. The game needed to run on consoles, the combat needed to be accessible, and the narrative had to be cleaner. Gone were the dynamic factions, open-ended exploration, dense world simulation that defined the series. Instead, the project pivoted into something more linear, more focused, more marketable.
But you're so supreme. I give my life.
By 2009, the game had a new name, Arcania, a Gothic tale, not just Gothic 4, because this wasn't really Gothic 4. At least not in spirit. That subtitle was meant to soften the blow for long-time fans while signaling to new audiences that this was a fresh entry point.
By all the gods! Not again!
And for Spellbound, that wasn't just a marketing spin, it was the truth. Internally, the team was designing Arcania with a new player base in mind. They knew that the Gothic legacy was complex, heavy and full of expectations, so they tried to split the difference. Include just enough lore and references for returning players, but redesign the mechanics to fit a modern platform and casual audiences. What could possibly go wrong?
Oh, you mean the... I can explain.
Oh, really?
The first real look at Arcania came at Gamescom 2009. A flashy new trailer, dramatic music, sweeping vistas. On the surface, it looked promising. The environments were pretty, the animations looked smooth. Spellbound showed off some combat, teased a story of betrayal and revenge, and promised a dark and immersive world. But even in those early previews, cracks started to show. Gone were the grizzled, morally ambiguous factions of old. Instead, Arcania featured simple archetypes, a generic evil king, a chosen hero, a cookie-cutter love interest. The player character? No longer the grumpy, nameless protagonist of the original trilogy. Now you were a young man from Fresher, driven by revenge after his village was burnt. It felt formulaic. Hands-on impressions from the media were lukewarm. The game looked nice, sure, but it felt simplified. Journalists noted the quest structure was streamlined to a fault. NPCs gave you tasks, marked them on the minimap, and you followed objective arrows. Classic Gothic fans weren't having it. You don't need a journal full of icons in Gothic 2. You had to listen. You had to learn. You had to get lost in the swamp and find your own way out. That was magic. Spellbound, meanwhile, was under pressure to deliver something that actually worked. Remember, Gothic 3 was a technical disaster. JoWooD wanted to avoid another catastrophe, and that meant keeping the scope tight and the systems simple. So they made compromises. Lots of them. Another quiet challenge behind the scenes? The engine. Instead of using Piranha Bytes' Genome engine, which powered Gothic 3, Spellbound opted for a heavily modified version of the Vision engine. This gave them more control over lighting and physics, but it also meant rebuilding core systems from scratch. That included AI behaviors, combat logic, and pathfinding. All things that had taken Piranha Bytes years to tweak, Spellbound was trying to do in less than 2. And it showed. Behind the glossy trailers, the build was buggy. NPCs walked in circles, dialogue trees broke, combat animations desynced, and unlike the buggy charm of Gothic 1 or 2, these problems didn't feel forgivable. They felt like a rushed foundation on shaky tech. The release date slipped, first from 2009 to early 2010, then to October 2010. JoWooD kept the hype machine running, but insiders knew the game was in trouble. Still, on the surface, everything looked fine. The trailers were more polished. The name was shortened to just Arcania Gothic 4, a final attempt to satisfy both the legacy fans and the new console audience. They even commissioned a full orchestral score with composer Rai Rosenkrantz, a veteran of the original Gothic series, returning to give it a classic sonic identity. It was the right name, the right music, the right vibe? Sort of. But would the game actually feel right? By late 2010, the Gothic forums were a war zone. On one side, longtime fans accusing JoWooD of selling out. They pointed to the watered-down quest systems, the lack of factions, the absence of deep NPC schedules or immersive sim elements. This wasn't Gothic, this was Gothic in name only. On the other side, curious newcomers and hopeful defenders. Maybe it wasn't the same Gothic, but who says change is bad? Maybe it could bring a franchise to a wider audience and still be fun. Spellbound tried to reassure everyone. They gave interviews about staying true to the lore. They emphasized that the game would continue the story after Gothic 3. They teased the return of King Robar III, aka the nameless hero from the old games, now corrupted by dark magic. There were even familiar monsters like scavengers and bloodflies. But the magic was already leaking out. Gothic isn't just about names and monsters. It was a feeling, a mood, and increasingly Arcania felt like it was missing that completely. Still, October 2010 arrived, and with it, the game's official release. And from the moment it hit shelves, the real backlash began. When Arcania Gothic 4 finally launched in October 2010, it wasn't a total disaster in the technical sense. At least not on the surface. The game booted and ran. It didn't hard crash every 5 minutes like Gothic 3 did at launch. It had cleaner animations, better frame pacing, and a UI that didn't feel like it had become held together by duct tape and hope. So, success? Not quite. Critics were divided. Most leaned lukewarm. Arcania scored in the mid-60s to the low 70s on most platforms. Outlets like IGN called it decent but forgettable, praising the visual polish but panning the story, pacing and the lack of player agency. Eurogamer was more blunt, calling it aggressively average. It wasn't broken, it was just bland. Worse than bad, maybe? Because you know what? Even a broken Gothic game had character, a soul. Those janky mechanics, you could work around them, you could mod them, but you couldn't fake the Gothic vibe, that sense of being an underdog in a brutal world that didn't care whether you lived or died. Arcania had none of that. Combat was floaty and unbalanced. Factions were gone. Dialogue trees were reduced to linear monologues. The world felt static, with NPCs locked into stiff routines. And the protagonist? A cardboard cutout. Gone was the nameless anti-hero who clawed his way up from prison rags. Now you played as a generic village boy with a dead girlfriend and a magical destiny. Yawn. The fan community exploded, and not in a good way. On forums like World of Gothic and RPG Watch, threads burnt hot with betrayal and disappointment. This isn't Gothic, one post began. This is Fable, Gothic Edition, and not even the good parts of Fable. And the comparisons stuck. Many fans felt Arcania was Gothic filtered through the lens of westernized, console-friendly design. Gone were the gritty mechanics and the emergent world behavior. What happened was a linear questing, hand-holding, and button-mashy combat. JoWooD did try to deflect. They insisted the game was a new chapter meant to introduce new players to the franchise while honoring the past, but nobody was buying that. The problem wasn't that it was different. It was shallow, and the community could tell it had been designed with marketing spreadsheets instead of creative vision. It didn't take long for the cracks to show even deeper. Despite its visual polish, Arcania was rushed. The quest design was repetitive. Enemy AI was brain dead. Entire regions felt copy-pasted. The engine struggled with streaming data, leading to stutters and popping, even on mid-range PCs. Console players on the Xbox 360 had it worse. The game's frame rate dipped during combat, and some textures looked like they belonged on a PS2. Then there was the balance. Spells trivialized most encounters. Healing potions had no cooldown. Enemy types barely varied beyond reskinned melee mobs. You could hack and slash through the game in 15 hours tops. That might be fine for action games, but this was supposed to be Gothic 4. The bar was way higher. And let's not talk about the voice acting. Oh god, actually scratch that. Let's. Because it was rough. While the German version had respectable performances, the English dub sounded like it had been recorded during lunch breaks. Wooden delivery, weird timing, and zero chemistry. A dramatic death scene became laughable. Serious moments felt like memes for a series once praised for its gritty tone. This was a massive tonal misfire. While Spellbound stayed mostly quiet during the backlash, JoWooD kept trying to spin the narrative. They pushed press releases emphasizing international sales potential. They teased future expansions, and they talked loudly about their multi-year plan for Gothic universe. Behind the curtain though, it was panic mode. JoWooD had sunk a lot into Arcania. Too much. The game's production cost had ballooned, and with meddling sales and bad press, the returns weren't matching the investment. By early 2011, JoWooD was in serious financial trouble. Share prices dropped. Development on the Fall of Satyruf expansion halted mid-cycle due to legal disputes. The vague euphemism that later turned out to involve licensing fights, unpaid bills, and back-end chaos with investors. Employees were reportedly let go or reassigned to other projects. Morale was cratering. There were rumors of unpaid wages, internal fights over royalties. Some in the industry whispered that JoWooD had actually over-leveraged themselves, trying to go too big with Arcania, and now they couldn't afford to patch the game properly. It was starting to look like Gothic 4 might be the franchise's swan song, and JoWooD's too. For Spellbound, the reception to Arcania was a gut punch. They'd taken on a beloved series, spent years trying to build something cohesive under publisher pressure, and ended up alienating the very audience they were supposed to win over. Their vision had been compromised early and often, and it showed. Developers close to the project would later admit that design changes were imposed from above, that deadlines were brutal, that the engine, while visually strong, was fragile under load. Some even claimed that they warned JoWooD about scope issues months before launch, only to be told to make it work, end quote. In hindsight, Spellbound might never had a fair shot. They were handed a broken legacy and asked to modernize it without offending anyone. It was like being told to rewrite The Godfather as a Saturday morning cartoon, and then get blamed for it when the fans walked out. Still, there was one last chance for redemption. The Fall of Satyruf. The long-promised expansion meant to continue the story, deepen the lore, and maybe, just maybe, win back some goodwill. But that story would have to wait because JoWooD was about to implode. By early 2011, JoWooD production was no longer just struggling, they were free-falling. Behind the scenes, the publisher had been on shaky financial ground for years, over-leveraged, underperforming, and still reeling from the rocky launches of Gothic 3 and other IPs. The Guild 2, anyone? JoWooD was betting big on Arcania to save the ship. Instead, the game's lukewarm reception and even colder commercial performance was the final crack in the hull. The real kicker? The Gothic name couldn't even legally help them anymore. Wait, who actually owned Gothic? Here's where things get messy. After the troubled Gothic 3 development, original developers Piranha Bytes and JoWooD had parted ways, and the two companies had quietly entered into a legal agreement over the Gothic IP. The deal? JoWooD could continue developing games set in the Gothic universe without Piranha, but only under certain licensed terms and for a limited time. So when Arcania released, it was technically Gothic 4 in the title, just Arcania Gothic 4, a subtitle, but important shift, because legally the series no longer belonged to JoWooD in the long term. That borrow time situation would come back to bite them hard. By late 2010, JoWooD had already announced Arcania Fall of Satyrov, a standalone expansion promising to continue the story and address criticisms. They pitched it as darker, more intense, with new environments and, get this, a playable secondary character. Marketing material hyped up a demonic invasion, a mysterious masked villain, and a story that would, quote, shake the world of Gothic to its core, end quote. But internally, the cracks were widening. Development was reportedly chaotic, resources were stretched thin, deadlines were immovable, and even more concerning, JoWooD was broke. Then came the lawsuits. In March 2011, JoWooD released a cryptic statement. Fall of Satyrov had been delayed to legal uncertainty regarding the rights of some assets. Translation? They were getting sued. What followed was a legal fog so thick that even fans didn't know what to believe. There were rumors of unpaid licensing fees, internal splits between investors and creditors, and disputes with outsourced partners who worked on parts of the expansion's code and assets. Some German-language financial blogs speculated that the delay was due to outstanding debts linked to outsourced animation work. Others claimed it was with a fight with the co-financiers over the Gothic brand's residual value. No one at JoWooD would confirm specifics. Then, the bomb dropped. On April 20, 2011, JoWooD officially filed for bankruptcy. The Austrian company had been granted temporary protection from creditors earlier in the year, hoping to restructure and survive. But the math just didn't work. They were 25 million euros in debt, with virtually no liquid cash and a lineup of underperforming games. Arcania had failed to turn the tide, and legal trouble around Satyrov only poured salt into the wound. As the court-appointed receivers stepped in, JoWooD seized active publishing operations. Their entire catalogue, Gothic included, was now up for grabs. Enter Nordic Games. Yes, that Nordic Games. The low-profile Austrian publisher best known for buying up failed IPs at auctions like a scavenger with a shopping cart. In August 2011, they purchased JoWooD's assets wholesale, including all rights to the Gothic franchise and its various spin-offs. Suddenly, the fate of Gothic wasn't in the hands of the original developers, Piranha Bytes, or the troubled Spellbound, but in a third-party publisher who had never worked on the series before. And with that acquisition came an awkward epilogue. Remember Fall of Satyrov, the expansion that had been legally frozen in limbo? Nordic Games, now holding the rights, wasted no time. With barely any fanfare, Fall of Satyrov was released digitally on October 25th, 2011, 7 months after its original delay. It launched on Steam with zero marketing, zero patches, and zero major updates. Just a bare-bones product that felt like a ghost of a game. And players noticed. Satyrov was short, roughly 4 to 6 hours. It was painfully linear, and even more than Arcania. It reused assets liberally. The story was incoherent, clearly written around constraints. The new playable character gimmick? Shallow and poorly explained. To many fans, Satarov was less of an expansion and more of a posthumous cash-in. It was Gothic's equivalent of a post-credits blooper reel, awkward, unnecessary, and quietly depressing. Worse, it confirmed a growing fear that the Gothic universe had been officially zombified, milked dry, stripped of its soul, and reanimated by publishers who didn't understand or care about the world that had once meant so much to fans. While JoWooD was collapsing, Spellbound wasn't exactly thriving either. The failure of Arcania had hurt their standing in the industry. They had another game in the pipeline, Ravensdale, a steampunk action RPG with promising tech, but publisher confidence was low. The studio struggled to land fresh deals. In 2012, Spellbound filed for insolvency. They were later restructured and rebranded as Black Forest Games, with some of the same staff but a new mandate: no more sprawling fantasy RPGs. It was a quiet but symbolic death. The team that had once handled the Gothic torch had lost their grip. Not through incompetence, but through a perfect storm of poor planning, corporate pressure, and impossible expectations. And now, Gothic was in limbo again. When JoWooD sank in 2011, it took with it more than a dozen developers' dreams, a half-baked expansion, and the Gothic name's already tarnished reputation. But something curious happened in the years that followed. The series, battered, broken, nearly buried, didn't die. Not really. Somehow, Gothic refused to be forgotten, and it wasn't thanks to a publisher, it was the fans. After acquiring JoWooD's assets, Austrian publisher Nordic Games found themselves holding the keys to multiple IPs: Spellforce, Painkiller, The Guild, and of course, Gothic. But what could they do with Gothic now? Arcania had flopped, Satarov was radioactive, and the original creators, Piranha Bytes, were no longer involved. It was like inheriting a classic car that had been wrecked, hastily duct taped together and then abandoned in a ditch. I mean, you could try and drive it, but should you? Nordic's first move? Re-releasing the existing games. They bundled Gothic 3 with the long-awaited community patch and cleaned up the Arcania releases for digital storefronts. Arcania The Complete Tale was released on Steam, GOG, and even consoles like the PS4 and Xbox One. But let's be honest, it didn't set the world on fire. If anything, these reissues felt more like a contractual obligation than a passionate revival. Arcania on PS4 ran like a potato with stage fright, and Gothic 3, even patched, was still kind of a mess. For a while it seemed Gothic 3 was just another relic Nordic Games had bought at auction. The company had scooped up dozens of IPs after THQ's collapse in 2013 and later rebranded as THQ Nordic. But owning IPs doesn't mean knowing what to do with them. So the fans took charge. It's hard to overstate how important the Gothic's modding scene has been. Since the early 2000s, dedicated German and Eastern Europe fans had kept the game's original trilogy alive through fan patches, texture overhauls, total conversions, and lore-deepening expansions. In fact, Gothic 3's eventual stability came almost entirely from the community, not JoWooD or Piranha Bytes. After Arcania's failure, many fans refused to accept it as canon. Entire mod projects cropped up to, quote, fix or overwrite its events. Some ambitious teams started building fan sequels or reimaginings in new engines. Others just created better endings for Gothic 3 to give the series closure it never officially got. One legendary project, Gothic Reloaded mod, attempted to completely remake Gothic 1 with updated graphics while preserving the original gameplay and story. It's still in development over a decade later. The message was clear. If the industry couldn't save Gothic, the fans would. And then something happened. In 2019, THQ Nordic quietly released a Gothic playable teaser. A short demo of a possible full remake of the original Gothic. It came out of nowhere, offered free to anyone who owned the previous Gothic game on Steam. It wasn't just a tech demo, it was a full reimagining, voiced dialogue, modernized combat, flashy Unreal Engine graphics. Very different tone, slick, cinematic and controversial. Some of the longtime fans hated it. It felt as if it missed the original soul, its grittiness, its weirdness, its European jank charm. It felt too safe, too polished, too modern. The hero's sarcastic wit had been swapped out for angsty monologues. The atmosphere felt sanitized. But others were intrigued. THQ Nordic promised that they were listening, even including a player survey with the demo. The feedback was mixed, but passionate. In a rare move for a publisher, THQ Nordic actually took the response to heart. They greenlit the full remake, but handed it to a new Barcelona-based studio, Alchemia Interactive, and promised more time, more resources and more authenticity. As of 2025, the remake is still in development with updates trickling in occasionally. Screenshots, combat previews, deep dives into world building. It's slow going, but it's still happening. Gothic is finally getting a shot at resurrection on its own terms. Now that Gothic 1 has been remade, where does this leave Arcania? In the eyes of many fans, Arcania is officially the non-canon cousin. It's like Metal Gear Survive of the Gothic franchise. Technically part of the timeline, but spiritually divorced. The Gothic remake won't even reference it. THQ Nordic had shown no plans to revisit Arcania or continue its storyline. The hero of Gothic 3, the original nameless hero, remains the real protagonist in the eyes of fans and the new development team. And that's probably for the best. Arcania was built on borrowed rights, a splintered fan base and a publisher in free fall. It wasn't a reboot, it wasn't a sequel. It was a placeholder, a stopgap born from desperation and ultimately a reminder that even beloved IPs can be mangled when passed between too many hands. But it served a purpose. Arcania's failure galvanized the Gothic community. It made fans double down on preserving what made the original so special. It reminded people that Gothic wasn't just about dark forests and rusty swords. It was about the tone, about freedom, about the weird, sarcastic edge that other RPGs just didn't have. In its own bizarre way, Arcania helped Gothic survive. So here we are, more than a decade after Arcania came and went like a damp sparkler. We lost a lot. Piranha Bytes' grip on its own creation, JoWooD as a publisher, the chance for a smooth Gothic 4. We watched legal battles and rushed expansions sour the taste for many. We saw a once revered franchise become a cautionary tale. But we also gained something. We gained a fan community that wouldn't quit, a modding scene that rivaled entire dev teams, a blueprint for how to keep a cult classic alive when the industry forgets it. And now, slowly we're seeing the dedication rewarded. Gothic is getting a second chance. Whether it soars or stumbles again is anyone's guess, but one thing's for sure. You can bury a franchise, you can bankrupt its creators, you can strip it for parts, but you can't kill a game that refuses to die.